everyone, I am 𝓒𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 and welcome to 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪𝓾𝓱𝓪 clear. So in this video, I'll start the section 3rd of class 11th history. You know that this section 3rd is the changing traditions, in which there are 3 themes, and in all of the themes we will talk about is what all we'll be talking about is just that how traditions changed, what changes occurred in the European countries during the time period, during those time period, in different chapters, in different themes. So in this video, I'll explain the first theme of this section, or the theme 6th of class 11th history, that is the 3 orders. So the 3 orders. Now this theme is basically about the 3 orders, or what changes occurred in the Western European part, you could say that West European countries during the medieval period. The medieval period is from the 5th century to 15th century, but in this chapter we'll be talking about from 9th century to 15th century. Major changes occurred between this time period. Now this chapter can be connected to the Roman Empire chapter as well. That was an empire across 3 continents actually. That was about the Roman Empire. Now you know what, then as we have seen that Roman Empire was at its collapse, and we have seen that many Germanic tribes, people have taken over to the Western Roman Empire. Now what happened that those were tribal communities, those were different tribes of you could say those are different Germanic tribes, and that is why military conflict was very frequent, because there was no unifying bond between them, there was no uniting power, and that is why military conflict was very frequent. And till that time, what happened, that land had become the major center of attention. What was happening, that people whoever controlled a lot of land were rich, were powerful, and land was also protected. That is why many a times wars were between different tribal communities. So you could say that during that time between Germanic tribes there were many military conflicts, and whenever a war happened, the main agenda was to protect the lands, because the land agriculture was done, many other things done, and now it was becoming more and more agrarian societies. So in this chapter we'll be talking about how these tribes were converted into countries, because they were also ruling over the Roman Empire, but how those countries emerged, the 3 orders, you could say, the social, political and economic changes, mainly in the western part where you can find France, Italy, UK, those countries. So we'll be talking about the changes occurred in these societies. Now the 3 orders here means that 3 categories. First one is the clergy, second one is the nobility, and the third one are all the common people, the peasants, the artisans, all those who are poor people, you could say. So you could say that those who are not included in the first and second you could say categories or orders, they will be in the 3rd order. So you could say that could be, in this chapter we'll be basically talking about the 3 orders: the clergy, the nobility, the peasants, or all the common people. Now let's start the chapter with the first topic, that is an introduction to feudalism. An introduction to feudalism. Now this chapter is very concentrated on the practice of feudalism as well. Feudalism that has been taken from a Greek word that feud. Feud means a piece of land. So basically feudalism is kind of a relationship that you could say that emerged in the medieval era between the peasant, between the lord, between the society, you could say, in all the aspects. It was a relationship in matters of social, political, economic and legal relationship. And it was like that peasants, lords, kings were there, church priests were there, and there was a kind of like feudalism system that was established. What happened that in talking about the economic terms, let's take peasants and lords. Now both will be like noble, all those lords were the noblemen, and that is why they had a lot of land. and as they had lots of land, they would need some workers to work on as well, and that is why the peasants always many times cultivated those lords' lands. And in terms of that, what happened that they would be given some wages, but their judiciary would be very much in the hands of all those lords. So it was not just economic you could say economic relationship, but they were social and political relationship as well, because not exactly the slave, you can say those peasants did have something, but what that you could say that during that time in the medieval era, the peasants were very bonded to the noble people. All those lords, you could say, they had to pay some taxes, they had to give their service and many other things. So you could say that was basically feudalism that spread across Europe. Now talking about, you could say that about the history sources, what happened that European historians since the last 100 years have been producing many history documents. They had started writing their history documents, legal documents, you could say, between king, lords and peasants and many other things. For example, if we go to the church kept records of births, of population, so that we can find about the population. And next was that the inscriptions on church wall also had some meanings, like they will be showing some festivals, they would be showing some kind of songs or some kind of lyric poem could be too. So you could say that those were also the sources of history. Besides that, we have a historian, that is Marc Bloch. Now Marc Bloch was a French historian and he did many good works as well on the feudalism, and his main agenda was that he was one of the group of historians that argued that history is not based just on international relations or the great like biographies of all those great people or the political history, but it talks about the collective behavior as well, the collective behavior and attitude of the people. Their other things should matter too. And that is why you could say that he had many works, but he was shot, like his work ended very tragically when he was shot by the Nazis during the Second World War in 1944, you could say. Now besides that, we have many other sources as well, like you will find many books, many historians who have written their theories in books and many other things. Now talking about Europe, you will see that all those documents are legal to, authentic to, and what's more that they have been kept as records. Like that was itself such a good thing, such a big thing, you could say. So you could say that feudalism was a kind of thing that spread in the medieval era. Well, it is said that its traces could be found in the Roman Empire during the 4th century, during the collapse of the Roman Empire. But it was also said that it has been introduced or established, emerged during the time period of Shaman, who was a king, you could say, of France. But we have seen that it emerged as a social, like as such a big platform in the 11th history. Its traces could be found even earlier, but if we talk about its proper state, it was in the 11th century. Now the next topic is France and England. So France and England. Now you know what, that Gaul was a province of the Roman Empire. Now that Gaul was like conquered, like it had such a big land. It was had two coastlines, mountain ranges as well, and many other things. What happened that you could say that it was conquered by the Franks. Franks, that was a tribe. So it was conquered by the Franks, and that is why Franks gave their own name to that Gaul province, and it is known as France. So from Franks, France has been emerged. You could say that the origins of these words matter as well. Now what happened that those Franks had their own livelihood. Those France or French, you could say Frankish kings or French kings, both are the same. They were Christian. You could say that Christianity, even though the Roman Empire collapsed, the Christianity still remained. Like it still survived to such a large extent that today it has become the world's first, you could say world's largest religion. So you could say that Christianity still survived, and that is why those Franks were also Christian. You know that one of the important things here is that even though Germanic tribes were ruling over the parts of Roman Empire, they considered their traditions too. Imperial traditions were carried out as well as their own cultural tradition of those tribes. Like German tribes, you could say German beliefs, cultures, but still Roman traditions were also continued. Some of them, not all of them. So you could say that Franks had given their name, and the same case happened to England as well, that we'll talk about later. Now Clovis became the king of Franks before the conquer, you could say before the conquest that we're talking about, around 700, not 700, he became the king in 481. After that, in 486, he and his Franks, like he became the king, president of the Franks group. So he and his whole team group, you could say Franks, declared a war against the Gaul province. And after that, what happened that you could say that after a long period of time, when Clovis is still king, there were another people as well, like Charles Martyr came up, and after some time he became the mayor of the palace. Actually, when he became the mayor of the palace, that means that he had all the responsibility of the palace. What should the king wear, where the garden should be, what the garden should be like, and all the things that were related to internal affairs of the palace were like settled by this person. After that, his son conquered Clovis and became the king of France. Now his son was Pepin, and Pepin's son was Charlemagne. So you could say that Charlemagne, or the Great Charles, was you could say indirectly the ruler like this. And what happens that he was even given the title that was a Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope Leo III. So he had been given that title by a pope, you could say. So that itself a big thing. That is why he's also known as the Holy Roman Emperor because he had like revived or rescued some of the beliefs of the Roman Empire. So you could say that is about the France, and England will study later as well. Now the next topic here is the three orders. Now three orders. You know what that during that time, during the medieval era that we're talking about, is that you know what that they were clergy priests actually. They thought that there had to be three divisions: those who fight, those who pray, those who work. Actually, this is about the nobility, the clergy, and the peasants. You could say that Abbess Hildegard of Bingen said that you cannot keep, no one can keep different kind of cattle in just one stable. Cows, donkeys, sheep, horses, they can't be kept at a single stable. Same happens with the human beings. Differences are meant to be. Even though we are the like child of the God, he loves all of the child, but there is no equality from them, and that is why the three orders emerged. The first order was the clergy. Clergy includes priests, bishops, those people working in churches. They had their own pride, you could say. The second one included nobility. Nobility, you might know that whom we call like lords. In many of the movies it has been shown. The third one were all the common people, the peasants, all those poor people, laborers, and all those people. So let's talk about them with the next topic, that is the second order, the nobility. So the second order, the nobility. Now let's talk about the second order, that is the nobility. The church priests placed themselves as the first like order, and they placed nobility as the second order. Now you know what, that nobility had an important role, very important role in social processes, because during that time there was a system of vassalage. vassalage, you know what that is? That system, it was because of that system the kings were related to the common people, and the mediator between them was a noble person. What happened that the kings of France made the noble man, or you could say nobility, as their vassals. The nobility made the peasants as their vassals. You could say that in vassal system, land was given to the noble people, to nobility by the king, and the nobility accepted, you could say accepted the king as sojourner, or it could be senior in English language. Now you know what, that they were mutually benefited by each other. So this kind of vassalage was mutually beneficial for both the king and the nobility. Now what happened that you could say that during that time, around the 13th century, now what happened that as the kings, you could say that had given the land, the noble person had absolute right over that land. Like peasants would be living, their own dwellings would be there, they would have some pastoral lands as well, peasants would be working as the tenants, and many other things were there. And these nobility had some privileged rights as well, their status was high. You know what, that when this was like vassal system was made, what would happen that first the king and the noble would go to a church. It would be kind of ceremony where both of them will take vows and some rituals would be performed. After doing that ceremony, it would be like, you could say that it would be mandatory for them to follow, and after that the nobility would go to their own way and the kings would be gone to their own way. But nobility would give land to the peasants and make them work for him, and that is how the king and the common people got connected, because peasants' house, the land completely was given to the noble, the king had given. So there was a kind of indirect connection between them. So you could say that nobility was not just an easy body to understand. Like in nobility we have term lords, they would be called as lords by the peasants, by the common people, and same happens for the king. The nobility would call the king his highness and those kind of things, saying the lords. So you could say that those were the nobility privileged, they were born with privileged rights. You could, their status was very high, they could do whatever they wanted in their land. Now the next topic here is the manorial estate. So the manorial estate. Now the dwelling of a noble person is known as manor, and the manorial estate is like that. You could say that nobles had been given a large part of land. It could be an estate as well. There would be dozens of peasant families living, and if that land is big to some big noble person, there would be 50 to 60 families living on. Those would be mainly peasants and many other families as well on that land. Now almost you could, on that land, on that estate that had been given to the noble person, there would be his own dwellings, that is his manor, then big pasture lands for feeding his horses, cattle, then tenant peasants would be living on there, making their small houses, very small houses, and those peasants would have to work in noble's field and their field, and they would be ready to serve of army, like they had to be ready on foot to serve the army at any time. And except for that, there were large, vast, you could say, woodlands were there in the estate, in the manorial estate, you could say, and there were forest area as well, so that the noble could hunt. You could say that during that time hunting was also so prevalent in the society. So that is why almost everything that was needed for life was present there. For example, the food, the grain was grown by the peasants. Blacksmiths and carpenters implemented and repaired, made, invented, you could say, weapons or the furnitures of the houses. Besides that, there were also some many other you could say professions doing work, like women would spin the clothes, would spin the fabric for them. Children too would be working in wine presses. So you could say everybody was working. And there were castles for defense as well, like the defense of that estate was also very important to maintain, and that is why castles were also made. By the 13th century, these castles were made bigger as for the knights' families. In fact, in England, these castles had been unknown until the conquest of Norman prince. You could say that England was conquered by a Normandy prince, that is the province of France. So of course, during that time, the England didn't know about the castles, but after the conquest of the Norman prince, it got to know. And you could say that in England, what happened that castles had become an administrative power, the military power. So the manorial estate, that is not like all the needs would be filled. Almost everything would be present there, but not the everything. Many noble people would have to get many things from outside resources as well. For example, those who wanted to live in luxury, they would need to have musical instruments, ornaments, luxurious furnitures from outside sources, and many other things besides that, you could say that, were also imported, were also from the outside sources. So you can't just think that you could say everything was present everywhere in the estates. So that was not possible at all. Just think logically, how could that be? Even if there was a conquest by anybody, that was because of sources. You could say that when France conquered the Gaul province, mainly because of the resources, it has been said that, not clear evidence, but it has been said that because the resources were deteriorating and were reducing to zero, that is why they wanted to conquer the province of Gaul. So you could say that there were many reasons behind the actions of the people as well. Now the next topic here is the knights. So the knights. Now let's talk about a new section of the people, that are knights. Now by the 9th century, Europe had long-term wars with many of the countries. So they had localized wars in 9th century, and that is why there was a need. The amateur peasant soldiers were not sufficient for those wars. This led to the emergence of a new section for the society, that are the knights. Knights are linked to the noble. You could say that just as the same way as the nobles were linked to the king, you could say. So knights were also linked to the nobility in the same way. Like they would also take their vows or oaths for their loyalty to the nobility, So they would also be given some piece of land by the nobility. That piece of land would be called as fief. Fief would be granted to them, and as it was a feudal system, what would happen there? That peasants, of course, would be doing their service on that land, like they would be cultivating that land. And that land could be between 1,000 acres and 2,000 acres or even more, because it was for the whole family of the knights. Their house family members would be whoever was dependent on the knight could live there. So there were many facilities, like the castle would be built for him, a church would be there, there would be wine presses and many other establishments for the house dependents. There would be water mills as well. During that time, wine presses were very important because wines were drunk regularly by the people. So that was very important to have a wine press for the upper class people, for the nobility, for the king, or for the knights. the knights as an exchange would pay some money to the nobility and would grant them the service of the army. That is why knights could not just like sleep on the bed. They would be practicing at nights new tactics. They would be fencing with dummies, and after that you could say that the knights would be like, you could say that they would fight in the armies. They would fight as the soldiers for the nobility, as they were very needed during that time. So knights had arose to power. Many a times it was seen that they were serving more than one lord, but their main loyalty was with his foremost honor, foremost noble person. So that was the case with knights. Now the next topic we have here is the first order, the clergy. So the first order, the clergy. Now the first thing that might come into your mind is that why did we talk about the second order firstly and then secondly the first order? Why is it so? Because there is a reason. You know that we have talked about the second order, that is the nobility, that was related to social processes and the political processes, but clergy is of the religious importance, like they would be bishops, clerics, pope. So that was religious, and whenever we study these things, first we'll have to come over the political issue, political like perspectives, then we can come to conclusion of religious as well. So church we are studying right now, that is the first order, the clergy. Clergy includes all those clerics, bishops, pope, you could say that all those in church. So church also were like granted land by the kings, and they could also levy taxes. That is why they were not dependent on the king. They were such a kind of independent body. They were like you know what they said was that they were the messenger of gods. During that time, one thing was popular, that kings have been chosen by the god. The priests were the messenger of the god, and the common people were sent to work. Now for many years nobody like questioned these things, but as the time came up, as people like were thinking that not that was wrong, they would also rise up. That we'll study later in this chapter as well. So clergy, you could say church itself owned land, and it was an independent body. The master of the Western church was the Pope. He lived there. He had like some he would be there. He would be master of that church. In the Central and Eastern Europe, clerics and bishops would tell the people, would talk with the people, would give some prayers and some teachings to the Christians. Even in small villages, there would be a church. That was mandatory. That was everywhere. Like we have temples for Hindus, mosques for Muslims. That was the same thing for Christianity. So in Christianity too, in every village there was a church, and every Sunday people went there to listen to the prayers of those clerics or the bishops. Now you might think that everyone could become a priest. That was not true. Not everyone could become a priest. Serfs and women could not become priests. Physically handicapped could also not become the priests, and the men who became priests could not marry. So there was something like that. You could say that there were criteria for becoming a priest as well. They would be living in a like palace, glimmering palaces, and they would levy a tax that was tithe. Tithe was 1/10 of the produce or the yield of a peasant. So peasant would have to contribute, would have to give that much land, that much produce to the church. Now money would be given to them as the land was given to them, and what's more, that people, all those rich people, made endowments in the church for their deceased relatives to have a good life in afterlife. So you could say that for that purpose they were also making endowments to the church. Besides that, church also had some other ways of having money. Now there were some similarities between the customs of the nobility and the church, the clergy. in church, what happened that there was a custom that you had to kneel down to bow, hands clasped and head bowed. The same thing was a replica of how the knight paid his loyalty to the king, to the noble actually. Whenever he took oath for his loyalty to the noble person, he would do the same thing. That was a replica. And what happened that the term lord, that knights would be calling the noble people the lords. Now the church people, you could say priests, had given the god, they were also calling the god as a lord. So there were many similarities between the customs of the nobility, the social processes that happened because of them, and the clergy. Like they had their own pride, their own criteria, and if there were divisions, it was become that. Like for example, in India we had Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas and Shudras. That was the same thing. There were three orders, and here we had Brahmins, they had clergy, bishops, the clerics, those all clergies. Now the next topic that we have here is monks. Now apart from the church, there were some devout Christians that were the monks who chose to live isolated lives, in contrast to clerics who lived amongst towns and people in downtown area. Now these monks lived in monasteries, or those were known as abbeys. Two of the most important monasteries were those that were established by Saint Benedict in Italy in 529, and that of Cluny in Burgundy in 910. So these were two of the most important monasteries of that time. So these monks, in kind of a way, you could say that they were different from the priests, the clerics, as they lived isolated lives. They have taken an oath that they would spend their time studying, praying, or doing some manual work, that was agriculture, farming, anything. Unlike the church rule or the priesthood, it was that in monks, men as well as women could become. Men would become the monk, and the women would become the nuns. So there would be that men and women, both of them would become monks. And besides that, there were many abbeys. Most of them were single sex communities, except for few. That means that for men and women, separate abbeys were there. And what's more is that they still, like priests, like bishops, nuns and monks, could not marry. Like that was the rule of their principle. So you could say that they chose to live isolated lives that was far away from the human habitation. They were living in their own areas. The abbeys contributed to art of music, like Abbess Hildegard that we talked about, that he said that cattle could not be kept in a single stable. He was a gifted musician. He started like a community singing prayers in church, and after some time, many groups of the monks thought that they could move from one place to another, preaching people, talking to town people, and could lead their life on charity. So they would be they would not be exactly beggars, they would not be exactly priests, they would be in middle of them. They would be living on charity. So that was the case of monks. Those monks who had such a mentality were known as friars, and these have been, like you could say that there was a person, Langman, who was an English poet. He wrote that in his poem, he contrasted the lives of monks as that of pure faith by the simple plugmen, shepherds and poor laborers. Besides that, Chaucer, you might have heard about the Geoffrey Chaucer. In England, he wrote a poem in which he said that he had written Canterbury Tales. So in Canterbury Tales he had some comic portraits of nuns, of monks and friars as well. So that was about the monks from different kind of mentality, different kind of thinking, that was kind of good for them too if they want to live like that. Now the next topic here is the church and society. So the church and society, a very important thing to know. Now what was the relationship between the church and society? Now talking about the direct. Even though most of the Europe, almost all of the Europe had converted to Christianity, but still they did have some pre-Roman beliefs. Like in Christianity, we have two important dates or festivals that are birth of Christ, that is Christmas, and Easter. Christmas, that is the birth of Christ, celebrated on 25th December, is a replacement of an earlier festival celebrated by the Roman people, that was accordingly the solar calendar. Easter, that is the crucifixion of the Christ, and it is said that he was revived from dead on this day, is also a replacement of an earlier festival of the Roman people. But you know what, that there is no fixed date for this, as this festival that it has replaced was for the arrival of spring days after long days of winters according to the lunar calendar. So there is no fixed date for Easter. Now people on these days would go to their village town, to their hometowns, to their villages, but now they would still go, but now they would call it parish. Parish, that is a land under the supervision of a priest, so that is why it would be called a parish. Overworked people, overworked peasants and many other people would think of these holy days as their days. Like from holy days we have got holidays. So from holy days, that are the old sacred days, we have got the word holidays. So on this day they would be like drinking, having a feast, as it was there, no work would be done on that day. And that in France by the 12th century there were many minstrels going from place to place, going from manor to manor of nobility, to sing songs that were partially historical and partially invented, like imaginary. Those were about the brave kings and that of knights as well. Like you would find that in nobility house there would be a narrow balcony for there would be a feast, and on that balcony that minstrel would sing a song. So they were very good. These were very good things, because you know what, that during that time there were many people illiterate. There would not be people that were literate, and that was not a time for manuscripts, so people could understand things by the songs. That was the only way for them. So it was said under the church and society they had replaced some festivals and they had to maintain it. Like on that days, holy days would be given and people would just be feasting around, as it would be like a day for their joy, happiness. Now the next topic that we have got here is the third order, peasants free and unfree. So the third order, peasants free and unfree. Now let's talk about the third order, as we have already talked about the first order, the second order, that is the nobility. Now is the time for the third order, that was sustaining the first and the second order, and that was the peasants. Now cultivators were also of two types. First were the peasants, free peasants, and second were the serfs. Free peasants were those who were cultivating the land that was like a tenant of the Lord. That was the tenant of the Lord. They would be producing. The man would have to render military service for at least 40 days in a year, and his family would have to give at least 3 days in a week, usually 3 days in a week, but often it is more, for rendering service to other services to the noble's house, to the Lord's house, or you could say manor, not the house. Now those work would be, besides that there would be many work, like the women and children would have spun the clothes, made the candles, and you could say made wines from the wine presses. They would have to press the grapes for making wine for the lords, and many other works. Besides that, there were many unpaid works as well for the men, that were digging ditches, repairing roads, building fences, and many other things. So they were rendering services. They had to render services, and the output would be known as the you could say that lord peasant tenant, and would be given to the noble. So these peasants were like this. Land would be provided to them. They would be like tenants, would have to give some money to the nobility, and they could have their produce. Now the next were the serfs. Serfs, you could not say that you can't say that they're exactly the slaves, but somewhat similar to them as well. The serfs who were not free, who were unfree, that is the topic itself says. Now they did not have any land. They would have to work on the noble's land, exclusively on the land of the lords, you could say. Now in case of that, they would not be free, like they can't leave the estate without their permission. They can't they can only bake their bread in the oven of the lord. They can you could say that they can have flour, like for having flour you will have to press the wheat, that could be pressed only in his the lord's mill, you could say. So you could say that the serfs were not allowed to do anything whatever they wanted. They had to marry whoever the lord wanted. They could marry if they had their own choice, but they would have to pay some fees to the nobility. So there were two kind of peasants, cultivators. First were the free, the second were the unfree. Like they didn't have any rents, they didn't have any output from that land, even though they worked on that. So that was like that. Now the next topic here is England. Now let's talk about the England. You might know that whenever we talk about the UK or the United Kingdom, it's actually not just one country. It includes England, Northern Ireland, the islands of Wales, and Scotland. So they are like united, and that is why we call it United Kingdom. In it we have England, that is the main superiority, you could say. But now let's talk about its history as well. Now by the 6th century, Angles and Saxons were ruling, had settled over England and were ruling over that. Only then, in 11th century, the Duke of Normandy, who was William, conquered this England from the Saxons and Angles. You know what, that England is a variant name for Angle land. So from Angle land we got England. So that is why it is a kind of variant, you could say. So in 11th century, William I, it would be better to call it William I. And you know what, an interesting fact is that today's queen, who is the queen at present time in Britain, is descendant of this William I. So like we are talking about her ancestors actually. So this William I, you know what, during that time he was from France. Normandy was a province of France. So between France and between England there were so many disputes over trade and territory. In 11th century, William I had the land mapped of England and had 180 Norman dukes or nobility, you could say, to set up to have land in that England, that those nobles would be obliged to give service. Like they would have to provide knights for the king. They would have to pay some money to the they didn't have to pay the money, but they would have to give their knights. In many cases, they had to give their own lands to the knights so as for their service. But there is one thing to be remembered, that nobility could not use the knights for their own private warfare. That would be against. Like they could use them whenever the country was in like some kind of trouble, danger, but they could not use for their own private warfares. The Anglo-Saxons had now become peasant tenants. What happened that many a time they were a direct tax imposed by the king, that was 𝓤𝓲. 𝓤𝓲 was imposed like directly by the king, even though peasants had to pay. Nobility and clergy were excluded from paying that. That was itself such a big thing. Now the next topic that we have got here is factors affecting social and economic relations. So factors affecting social and economic relations. Now the first two orders thought that the social system was quite stable, but that was not it. Like there were some processes that happened gradually or in a more dramatic way, like for example the environment. Now the environment that was imperceptible, you could say that it was imperceptible, that is not it was a gradual change, could not be anticipated by anybody. There were another changes like in the change in the pattern of land use and many other things. So those factors led to the change in social and economic relations, because if there are changes in production, in land use pattern, then of course there will be changes in economic, the first one, and related to its social as well. So let's talk about them one by one. The first one here is the environment. So the environment. Now you know what, that during the time period of 5th to 10th century, there were large areas of forests in Europe. It has been found out that during that time there were many forests and the cultivation land was limited, not that much. During that time Europe was going under a cold spell, and that is why forests were covered in frost. There were prolonged winters, thus reducing the time of the crops, you could say the agriculture production. That it was only in the 11th century when that rivers happened. Again a warm period started, and now there were not prolonged winters. During that time now agriculture could be continued in a large period of time, because earlier it was frost, but now frost was also reducing, leading to soil fertility that could rise to the production of agriculture. So first thing is the environment. The climatic changes are very, very important for growing any kind of crop. Like now wheat was grown. So for that different kinds of crop are grown in different parts of the world. Why is it so? It is only because of the climatic change. So environment matters too. Now it has been seen that after 11th century by many of the forest historians, that forest area was receding after 11th century. It could be merely because the area under land cultivation was increasing. So that could be the main reason that the historians have thought. Now the next thing here is land use. Now land use is also very important aspect to know that how the land was used for agriculture. Now you know what, that land was used for agriculture and many other purposes, and you could say that there were peasants cultivating on that land. And now talking about, there was like an ineffective way of agriculture on those lands. That what they would do is that in a year they would divide their field into half. On one part wheat would be grown in winters, and another land would be left fallow. Now in the next season, for where the wheat was grown, it would be left fallow, and the fallow land would be produced or kind of grown on that land. So that was a kind of rotation that continued, that was of course not very effective. Now land use, you could say that due to this the soil was deteriorating, and thus in a way you could say that if it was deteriorating, the fertility was being lost. That is why agriculture could not keep pace with it. The nobles were seeing that their incomes were not that much. Now they saw that output could not be increased. That is why they forced the peasants to work even more and more on their lands, on the whole estate, that they were legally not bound to do so, and that is why they did not resist openly, but they had a passive resistance. That means that they were denied to do work that were unpaid work, like digging ditches, making fences, those kind of works, and many other things they were refusing to do. And you could say that they were like oppressing those nobles because they could not do so. They were doing that they were producing more products and keeping that for themselves as well. They were doing more work in their own fields than in their estates. So that was a land use pattern, you could say that in France, in the whole Europe, that was being continued. Now the next topic here is new agricultural technology. So new agricultural technology. Now you know what, that earlier there were only old agricultural technology actually. The only mechanical support that peasants had was the wooden plug that was like supported by the oxen. So you could say that the only mechanical system that they had was the wooden plug, and that was like it could not like dig up the earth that much, and that is why intensive labor was needed in a kind of way that land had to be dug for fertility by hands once in 4 years in an enormous ways. That is why labor was intensively needed for agriculture during that time. And after 11th century, new agriculture techniques also appeared. It was not like they would be always so primitive. Now new things happened. Now they were using the plugs with iron tips, not on the necks but on the shoulders. They were not neck harnessed, but they were soldier harnessed now. The second thing, they were using mold brakes as well. For animals, they were using, like for horses specifically, they were shod. Like you could say horse shoes were made for them, so that to prevent the foot decay of the horses, not the forces, so that if there is no decay in the foot of horses, of course they would run in a faster speed, in a more effective and efficient speed. Now windmills and water mills were also being used. Like their energy was produced. Water mills were used for producing wines and beers as well, by pressing down the grapes. Like there would be wheel going on, and from that it would be pressed on. There were windmills for like exerting energy as well. So there were new agricultural techniques as well. Now new agricultural technologies also came up, like I talked about the iron tipped plugs and many other things. One thing was that one revolutionary thing in fields of agriculture was that shifting from 2 years out of 3-year field. What happened that peasants, now cultivators, now what they were doing was that whenever there was a land, in autumn they would be growing something like wheat, and after that in months of spring, after 1.5 years after, they would be growing in spring like peas, lentils for human consumption, and oats and barley for horses. And in the next year, the third, you could say, field would be left fallow. So that was a revolutionary thing that happened in the agricultural field by the cultivators. Now during that time, agriculture doubled, like the production doubled, food availability doubled, and that is why, you know what, that now as peas were grown, lentils were grown, they were more nutritious for the people, for the citizens, you could say, and fodder was also produced for animals. The peasants got the opportunities from them. So there were new technologies. Now many of the big new technologies were not started. Some of them were started by the nobilities, by the lords, like such as windmills or water mills, you could say. So you could say that these were established by the nobility, as they were costly, they were so much expensive that cultivators could not afford it. But cultivators did establish many other changes, you could say, that were they made forges and smithies for repairing the plugs and horseshoes in a very cheap price. And by the 12th century they were you could say that the relationship between the lords and the peasants was untied a bit. What happened then? Now nobles were not asking, the lords did not ask for the services now, but now they were taking cash as rent. Peasants too were selling their produce, you could say, outputs in exchange of money, not in exchange of any other goods as they earlier used to do. So these were many of the changes that occurred in France and in Europe. Mainly we are talking about France and England actually in this chapter. After this we have got the next topic, that is a fourth order, new towns and townspeople. So a fourth order, new towns and townspeople. Now as there was an expansion in agriculture, so of course it will have a connection with three things, that were population, town and trade. Population that arose in Europe from around 43 million in 1000 to 62 million in 1200 and to 73 or around 74 million in 1300. So population arose, you could say that arose so much in Europe. That was merely because they were eating more nutritious food now, and that is why they could be expected to live 10 years more than they were expected in the 8th century. But still we have to consider the fact that women still did not have such a good condition, as the men had better food than women. That was the thing that happened. Because of it, what would happen, that the first aspect is that towns would grow up, because if the population is so much, the first thing to happen is that they would now want to settle down. They would be settled down far, you know that in the earlier days it were just centers for shopping, for selling their products and many other things, and as the time passed there were a town square, churches, establishments, roads, and by the time they converted into towns, and that is why many new towns were created like that. In towns there would be many other things going on, like these new section of, so you could say that these new section of the society came up. They could be called a kind of like fourth order in our sight, you could say, in our point of view. From what happened, that mainly in these areas were unskilled labor, such as there were many serfs. You know what, that it was a saying that town's air makes free. That is why serfs went there. Whenever a serf could go there for 1 year and 1 day without being discovered by their lords, they would be free. So that was the case, and in that area mainly there were the free peasants, free cultivators and the serfs who had escaped. So that was the situation of towns. Now towns were also flourishing so much as they were having a lot of trade. You know that in towns there was a need for specialized skills as well, such as lawyers, administrative officials. Instead of paying services, now peasants were paying taxes to the noble who the land belonged to, because an estate had been given to the noble. So if you are building something on that, of course you will have to pay something. Earlier it used to be services, but now it would be a tax. Besides that, these towns would generally be around a castle, a church. That were the main things. And in a town there will be a guild for economic expansion. A guild would be to check the prices, the quality of the product. There would be a wonderful kind of huge guild wall as well, guild hall, you could say. Guild hall was also there, where they would be like soldiers guarding at the doors, and inside they would be meeting for the prices and for many other things. So that was a guild where many guilds in guild hall many guilds met and decided to do such things. So that was a town. You could say the towns were flourishing at such an extent. They were rich merchants who were growing up, because now those cultivators had risen up to such an extent that they could even question the power of nobility. They were even becoming rivalry for the nobility. That was the case when these new towns came up. Now the next topic here is cathedral towns. Now cathedral towns. What happened that by the 12th century? In France, many cathedral towns were built. Actually, cathedrals were built, not the towns. You know that those big merchants had grown at such a big extent, and that is why they had to look a way for spending their money as well. And one of the way in which they spent their money was that they contributed to the church, to the monasteries, to the church, and to the cathedral especially. These cathedrals were owned by the monasteries, but they were contributed by other groups, other people as well. There were a lot of contribution as well. These cathedrals were huge. Like you could say that it was built in such a way that the voice of the priest could be heard by all the people in the hall equally. The songs sung by the monks would sound very well, would sound very you could say that very sweet to the people. And there were windows too. There were big windows, you could say, and there were stained windows actually. Those windows were made in such a way that by the sunlight they would radiate for people inside the church, and in night by the moonlight it would be not by the moonlight, by the candles in the church, in the cathedral, they would be like showing kind of a way to the people outside the church. It was made in such a way that bells could be heard by people from long away, that prayers had started. You can come now if you want to. And you could say that those were the things. In windows there were paintings showing the Bible stories, which could be read by an illiterate. That is read like that could be understood by an illiterate actually. So that was the situation of cathedrals. Now around cathedrals also towns grew, because you know what, they had become a kind of center of attraction, and that is why many kind of towns had been built around them as well. So by 12th century this started, and everything went like this. Now the next topic here is the crisis of the 14th century. So the crisis of the 14th century. Now till now we have talked that, we have studied about that there was so much flourishing of trade, towns had grown. But by the late of the 13th century and in the early 14th century, crisis came up in Europe. Like literally there were three factors due to which everything ruined that was established. First was that the climatic change. You know what, that the long term, that warm spell that had spread for the 300 years was now disappearing. Once again, after 13th century, there was starting of cold spell. Now snow healings could be seen, and just a different climatic change, due to which only 1 month period was left for agricultural season. Only in 1 month agriculture could be could be done, farming could be done. That was obviously not sufficient for the cultivators. You could say that affected even those people, peasants, the cultivators had the 3-year field rotation that could not help, because now the forest and you could say that the forest and pastures had grown in such a vast amount, but that had been used by the cultivators, and that is why due to shortage of pasturage, the number of cattle were also decreasing. There were many number of deaths of them as well. And you know what, that there was no concept of soil conservation, and that is why soil lost its fertility as well. It affected the trade as well. There was a large imbalancement between the agriculture and manufacturing because they were not equal people in it. There was a reason behind it where the ships from faraway countries were coming in Europe. They brought especially the rats carrying the bubonic plague, that is known as the Black Death, due to which a large number of cattle died in Europe, leading to such a large number of like you could say that such a large kind of epidemic situation in Europe. Like 20% of the population died, and in some areas it was 40% too. The population that was 73 million in 1300 had now been 45 million in 1400. That was quite a low amount. You could say that was not the thing that we want. And due to which now the prices of agriculture products were decreasing because there were very low people for buying them, and labor was needed intensively for agriculture. The demand for labor increased and the wages increased too. In England it increased by 250%. So that means that whoever laborer survived could work as a wage laborer, as a farm laborer at a high price. But that's a big thing quite too. So you could say that in 14th century crisis came up due to various reasons, due to which agriculture, farming, trade, township, everything got destroyed. You know, when the cities that were the center of trades got hit the worst, and the convents, the monasteries were affected too. Even though some countries had been isolated, when it spread to everyone. Nobody could run away from it. That was the situation, and whoever got infected, you could say probability was that he would die. So that was the concept, that was the thing that happened. Now the next topic here is social unrest. So social unrest. Now what happened that as there was less farming production now because there was crisis, what happened that lords were also in problem because they saw that their production was becoming low, and that was also at high prices, not high prices, it was low prices, but the wages had to be very high. That was like their situation would be hit severely too. That is why they thought of reviving the peasant service, like peasant tenant contract. That is, earlier that you had to give services. Now they were giving the money. Peasants were giving money to the lords, but now they were demanding for the services instead of money. Well, one of the reasons for crisis was also that for money, metals had been disappearing from Austria and Serbia. So they were not in that much of amount, and that is why that was also a big problem. So now the nobility, the lords wanted services because they wanted labor for their fields, and they were cunning to think that they would get a free labor, but that was not the case. The peasants, especially the educated, the merchants and the big ones, you could say that with a little bit power, they oppressed, they were opposing this very violently because they could not do the service, could they? They had their own land, they had to do their own work for their survival, and that is why they said that even though those rebellions were suppressed ruthlessly by the lords, but still their demand was assured that that contract would not be revived, that you won't have to give services. So even though they were suppressed, the peasants had assured that they won't have to revive that contract. Now the next topic here is political changes. Next and the last topic of this chapter. So political changes. Now that's the story of whole Europe, that the changes we have seen. Now let's talk about the 16th and 17th, 15th and 16th and 17th century. During that time, many kings appeared in these regions. They took power and changed the whole system. That is why by historians they were known as the new monarchs of different regions. For example, you could say that, for example, we have Louis IX in France, we have Henry VII in England, we have Isabel and Ferdinand in Spain, and yeah, in many other countries there were many other kings as well. It was dependent on the king, on the country, on the situation, you could say. And so there were many new kings that appeared. The first purpose of them was that they took the opportunity of the situation and rose into power. They wanted to maintain their army, and that is why they wanted to increase the taxes as well. They were seeing their like powerful and non-powerful citizens as well. So they were like monitoring those kind of things. Now they didn't want to give power to the lords as they had in the earlier phase, like the vassalage system. They had like demolished the vassalage system. Of course, nobility and clergy won't let you go, and that is why there were rebellions as well. In England, you would find rebellions in 1497, 1536, 1547, and in 1549. And not in this country, in many countries as well, you would find that there were many rebellions. Of course, lords would not want to lose their power. The kings wanted to increase taxes. That was also not so easy to do. That is why you know what, one thing was that lords saw that they could not could not be compared to the kings in future, and that is why they turned their survival into loyalties to them. Now they were not linked to the king, but they were seen as clients for the kings. There was a system of patronage that came up. Patronage could be bought with money as well. Whoever had money had to the money would be taken by the king to maintain the army, and he would be like linked to by the patronage, like a system would be created. But that was not like in the earlier system. In earlier system, that was a dependence and trust of the king. But now nobility won't have such kind of power. So those were about the new monarchs that they brought many changes. And after a lot of period of time, you know that France and England, the two main countries that we have. In France, you could say that Louis XI, when he became the king, Louis XIII, when he became the king, he had to call a meeting in 1614 of Estates General. If you have read the history of class 9th, you would definitely know the meaning of Estates General. Now, Estates General was like consultative assembly in where the members of estates came up. There were three estates or the orders that were the clergy, nobility, and the others. So that would have to be called for increasing taxes. It was called in 1614, and next time it was 1789 and the French Revolution. That is the next other chapter of class 9th. Besides that, we have England as well at the same time. In England, from a long period of time, even before the conquest of William I, what happened there was a consultative body for advice. Now that had been converted to parliament, where there were clergy as well as the nobility as well as the House of the Commons for the rural and you could say backward classes, backward people, you could say. But still, you could say that after many years, it got monarchy as well. Now the situation is like that. In present day, France is a republic and England is still a monarchy. That is the difference, because they took different paths after 17th century, and that is the whole chapter we have covered. In this chapter, that chapter was very interesting, wasn't it? Like, we discovered many social changes, many interesting things to know, many theoretical things, conceptual things as well. We saw that there were three orders. First order was the clergy, the second one was the nobility or the lords, the word you might have heard about. The third are all the peasants. The first who prays, the second who fights, the third is the one who works. And we have also seen some other aspects, the political changes and many other things. So this is all. I have covered all the topics and subtopics, and the next themes of this book will be covered in further upcoming videos. So stay tuned for the upcoming videos. Thank you very much.